Man, trying to stay informed these days, it really is a job in itself, isn't it? It feels like there's just so much information flying around, and it's tough to cut through all the noise and really focus in on what
I
matters.
hear you. It's overwhelming for sure.
Exactly. So that's what we're trying to do with these deep dives. Pick one thing and really go deep. And today, well, we're focusing on something that might have seemed like a passing moment, kind of a blip on the radar, but actually has some pretty big implications.
Definitely.
We're talking about the recent interaction between Donald Trump and the Supreme Court Chief Justice John Roberts,
Okay, yeah.
and specifically what it might tell us about the whole debate around presidential immunity.
Right. Presidential immunity, it's a big one. Always a lot of discussion around that.
Right, and this interaction just kind of brings it all back into focus. So we're using a transcript from Glenn Kirshner's YouTube channel as our guide for today.
Makes sense. He always does a great job of breaking down these complex legal issues.
Oh, absolutely. He's fantastic. So our mission today is pretty simple. We want to understand why this seemingly minor exchange between Trump and Roberts matters, and what the legal landscape around presidential immunity could look like going forward.
Sounds good. Yeah, let's dig into it.
Okay, so the Daily Beast, they reported that after a speech to Congress, Trump went out of his way to thank Chief Justice Roberts.
Oh, interesting.
And this wasn't just a quick, hey, thanks. Apparently, he shook Robert's hand, tapped him on the arm, and said something like, thank you again, won't forget it. And immediately, I don't know about you, but my mind starts racing. Won't forget what exactly?
Yeah, it definitely makes you wonder. What's he referring to?
Exactly. And the Daily Beast article itself, it pointed out that there have been, and I'm quoting here, more than a few instances over the past few years of Supreme Court intervention in favor of the president. So, yeah, definitely raises some eyebrows.
It does. And that's precisely where the whole concept of presidential immunity becomes so central to this story. As Glenn Kirshner discussed in his video, it was actually Chief Justice Roberts who wrote the Supreme Court's ruling just last year that granted former presidents what a lot of people described as sweeping immunity from prosecution.
Yeah.
And this was specifically for actions that fell within their core constitutional functions.
Wow, sweeping immunity. That's a strong phrase.
It is. And it was, and still is, a really significant and controversial decision. I mean, it has huge potential consequences for Trump's ongoing legal battles, especially those related to the 2020 election. You know, we're talking about cases in Washington, D.C., Georgia, and who knows where else.
Right, because that ruling, when it came out, it felt like a potential game changer. I mean, the idea that a former president could be completely shielded from prosecution for things they did in office, that's a huge deal.
It is. It really raises questions about accountability and the balance of power.
Absolutely. And it's not just that one ruling, right? I mean, we also saw the Supreme Court allow Trump to stay on the ballot despite all those arguments based on the 14th Amendment.
Right.
And they narrowed the scope of some of those obstruction charges related to January 6th. So when you look at all of that together, and then you see Trump specifically thanking Roberts like this, it's hard not to wonder, you know, what's going on behind the scenes. Is he thanking Roberts for past favors? Is he maybe hinting at expecting future favors? It's intriguing, to say the least.
It's very intriguing. And I think the timing of his thanks, right after his speech to Congress, and the specific wording he used, won't forget it, in the context of these rulings that we just talked about, well, it's hard to see it as just a casual thank you. You know, it just seems like there's more to it.
Yeah, it definitely feels calculated, like he's sending a message. And, well, never one to shy away from offering his perspective, Trump later went on Truth Social to explain himself. You know, he said, the fake news media is trying to make trouble between me and the Supreme Court, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
His explanation was that he was simply thanking Roberts for swearing him in at his inauguration, you know, way back when, years ago.
Oh, okay.
And he even said Roberts did a really good job. But come on, really. Thanking him with that kind of emphasis, won't forget it, years after the fact, it just doesn't really add up. It feels, well, let's just say it feels a little unconvincing.
Yeah, I mean, given the timing right after that speech to Congress, and with all these legal battles going on where presidential immunity is a key issue, well, you know, Roberts was the one who defined that immunity in his opinion. Well, let's just say that explanation seems a little thin.
A little thin is putting it mildly, I think. It's absurd. But okay, let's put that aside for now and get to the really big question that Kirshner raises in his video. And it's a question a lot of people are probably wondering about. Can the Supreme Court actually go back and reverse its own ruling on presidential immunity?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the answer is yes, they absolutely can. The Supreme Court definitely has the authority to overturn its own precedents.
Hmm.
Now, it doesn't happen all the time, of course, and that's because of the principle of stare decisis, which is Latin for to stand by things decided. Basically, this principle is all about promoting stability and predictability in the law. So courts are generally expected to follow previous rulings.
So it's not like setting something in stone, but it's kind of like, there's a strong preference to stick with what's already been decided.
Exactly. But it's not an absolute unbreakable rule. And we've seen this throughout history. There are plenty of examples where the Supreme Court has, changed its mind on really important issues. One of the most powerful examples, and Kirshner brings this up in his video, is Brown v. Board of Education. This was the landmark case that overturned that whole separate but equal doctrine, the one that had been established in Plessy v. Ferguson years earlier. And it was such a crucial correction of a major, major wrong.
Right. That's a great example. Everyone learns about that one in school.
Exactly. It's a classic case of the Supreme Court recognizing that a previous decision was just plain wrong, and they had the courage to overturn it. And more recently, we've seen the Dobbs case, which overturned Roe v. Wade. Now, that's obviously a much more controversial example, but it still demonstrates that the court does have the power to revisit and change its mind, even on issues that have been settled law for a long time. So, to answer your question, yes, the mechanism is absolutely there for them to reconsider the presidential immunity ruling if they wanted to.
Okay, so that's really important to know. The possibility exists. But then the next question, and I think this is where it gets even more interesting, is what could actually lead the Supreme Court to reconsider this issue? What would have to happen? What would be the vehicle, as Kirshner calls it, that would bring this back before the court? And what would be the reason for them to actually take a second look? I mean, they're not just going to revisit a topic because someone asks them nicely.
No, definitely not. There has to be a specific case, a set of circumstances that compels them to take action.
Yeah.
And Kirshner, in his video, he lays out a hypothetical scenario, but it's a scenario that's grounded in reality. It's totally plausible.
Okay, tell me more.
Okay, so it centers around the idea of a former president continuing to defy federal court orders. And we've already seen reports suggesting that Trump and his administration might have disregarded court orders in the past. So imagine this, right? Trump continues to ignore or maybe even directly violates lawful federal court orders.
Okay, I'm following.
Now, if he was found to be in criminal contempt of court, and that means intentionally disobeying a lawful order from a federal court, and then he was convicted, well, that conviction would definitely be appealed. And as that appeal moves through the legal system, it could very well end up right back at the Supreme Court.
Makes sense.
And in that situation, if Trump were to argue that presidential immunity protected him from the consequences of violating those court orders, well, that would be a huge issue. It would be front and center in the appeal, and the Supreme Court would almost certainly have to address it.
Wow. So just the act of defying a court order, that could be the very thing that forces the Supreme Court to take another look at presidential immunity. That's a fascinating thought and a little bit terrifying if you think about it.
It is, because it really goes to the core of the balance of power, and specifically the authority of the judiciary. And that brings us to another big question, one that a lot of listeners are probably thinking about right now. With the current leadership at the Department of Justice, how realistic is it to think that Trump would actually be prosecuted for contempt of court? Even if he did blatantly violate a court order, would the DOJ actually go after him?
Yeah, that's a big question, isn't it? If the DOJ isn't willing to take action, then this whole scenario that Kirshner is talking about, it just falls apart.
Right, exactly. So how do we get around that potential roadblock? Well, this is where Kirshner points to a really clever solution that was used in a recent case involving Mayor Eric Adams in New York.
Okay, I'm listening.
In that case, the judge, Judge Dale Ho, he did something pretty unusual. He decided to bring in outside counsel, a lawyer named Paul Clement, who actually used to be the Solicitor General. So he's got a ton of experience arguing cases before the Supreme Court.
Okay, and what did Clement do?
Well, Clement filed a legal brief that addressed this very issue. What happens when someone ignores a court order, but the DOJ might not be willing to prosecute?
Right, so how does this tie back to our conversation about presidential immunity and the Supreme Court?
Well, here's the key point that Clement made in his brief. He argued that courts have what's called inherent authority to initiate contempt proceedings whenever their orders are disobeyed.
Inherent authority, meaning they don't need anyone's permission to do it.
Exactly. It's a power that comes with being a court. And Clement went even further. He argued that this inherent authority includes the ability to appoint a private attorney to actually prosecute the contempt case if the Department of Justice chooses not to get involved.
Wow. So the court isn't powerless in this situation. They don't have to rely on the executive branch to enforce their rulings. That's a pretty big deal.
It is, and it's a really important safeguard against potential abuse of power. Clement even cited a Supreme Court precedent, a case called Young, to support his argument. That case established the principle that the judiciary has this inherent power to protect its authority and make sure its orders are followed.
It makes sense when you think about it.
Right. I mean, imagine if the courts were completely dependent on the executive branch, specifically the DOJ, to address every challenge to their authority. What if the executive branch, for political reasons or whatever, decided not to enforce a court order against, say, a powerful individual? That would completely undermine the system of checks and balances. The courts would be toothless. So this inherent authority, it's there for a reason. It protects the judiciary's ability to do its job and uphold the rule of law.
So let me see if I can summarize this whole thought experiment that Kirshner is laying out.
Yeah.
Even if the DOJ decides not to pursue contempt charges against a former president for violating a court order, the court itself could potentially step in, initiate those proceedings, and even appoint a special prosecutor to handle the case. And if that case then went all the way up to the Supreme Court, the question of presidential immunity would almost certainly be on the table again for them to consider.
You got it. And that's the point Kirshner is making. It's not a prediction, but it's a very real possibility. It shows us how the Supreme Court could be forced to revisit its earlier ruling on presidential immunity, even without the DOJ taking the lead. And as Kirshner says, every time a former president appears to defy a court order, well, the likelihood of this scenario playing out, or at least the pressure on the judiciary to do something, it just keeps increasing.
So, yeah, we started with this seemingly simple thank you from Trump to Roberts, but it turns out there's a whole lot more going on beneath the surface.
Absolutely. It's not just about one thank you. It's about this fundamental tension between the branches of government and the power of the judiciary to enforce its own rulings. And that's a tension that we don't always think about, but it's incredibly important. It's at the heart of how our system of government is supposed to work.
Well said. So Trump's little thank you to Roberts, it might actually be a sign of a much bigger legal battle brewing.
Exactly. And the key takeaway for me is this. The courts have a responsibility and the power to uphold the rule of law. And that power includes the ability to enforce their own orders, even if it means going up against a former president. That's a crucial check on executive power. It's a reminder that no one, not even a former president, is above the law.
Yeah, that's a point worth emphasizing. No one is above the law. It adds a whole new layer of meaning to that thank you and that I won't forget it. So for our listeners out there, I want to leave you with this thought. We talk a lot about the checks and balances that are built into our government, but what are the ultimate safeguards against someone abusing their power? How does this whole situation with presidential immunity and the possibility of the Supreme Court revisiting it fit into that bigger picture?